The moment Margaret Turner stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, she knew with absolute certainty that her life was never going to be the same again, though she could not have imagined just how true that feeling would turn out to be. The town greeted her with the smell of horse sweat and dry earth, with the creak of wagon wheels on packed dirt roads, and the distant laughter of men spilling out of a saloon whose painted sign hung crooked on rusted nails. Redemption Creek was not a pretty place by any measure. It was a raw, stubborn settlement carved out of the Texas hill country by people too proud or too desperate to go anywhere else, and it wore its roughness like a badge. But Margaret had not come here looking for beauty. She had come here for work. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet determination that people tended to mistake for coldness, until they got close enough to realize it was something closer to courage. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and she carried that upbringing in her posture and in the way she spoke clearly and without apology. Her father had passed 2 winters ago, her mother a year before that, and she had sold the small house on Maple Street, packed what mattered into a single leather trunk, and answered an advertisement in the newspaper. Schoolteacher wanted, Redemption Creek, Texas. Room and board provided. Inquire with Mayor Hollis Crane. She had the letter of confirmation folded in the inside pocket of her green traveling coat. The stagecoach driver handed down her trunk with considerably less care than she would have liked, and she caught it before it could tip over into the dust. A few men on the boardwalk outside the general store watched her with the lazy curiosity of people who had nothing more pressing to do, and she met their eyes without flinching, which seemed to surprise them. She asked a boy of about 12 where the mayor's office was, and he pointed her down the main street past the livery stable, past the barber shop, past a building with a hand-painted sign that read Easton Brothers Freighting and Supply. She walked past that building without giving it much thought. Mayor Hollis Crane was a short man with an impressive mustache and the nervous energy of someone who had promised more than he was certain he could deliver. He shook her hand with both of his, ushered her into a chair that creaked alarmingly, and explained the situation with the kind of apologetic speed that meant the situation was worse than the advertisement had suggested. The schoolhouse, he told her, had burned down in January. Not completely, mind you. The walls were still standing, but the roof was gone, and half the floorboards were charred through, and the school's single bookshelf had become ash. He had been meaning to have it repaired before the new teacher arrived, he said, but there had been complications. He said the word complications with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to specify exactly what those complications had been. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to all of this without interrupting. "So there is no school," she said when he finished. "There is a school," Mayor Crane corrected. "There is simply no roof on the school. And the room and board," he brightened at this. "The room and board was perfectly intact. She would be staying with the Whitfield family on the eastern edge of town. Dorothy Whitfield was a fine woman, very welcoming, 2 children of school age. She would be comfortable there, he was sure of it. Margaret looked out the mayor's narrow office window at the street. A horse stood tied to a post, flicking its tail at flies. Across the street, a man in a worn leather vest was loading crates onto a freight wagon with focused efficiency, his dark hat pushed back on his head to reveal a face that was lean and tanned, and entirely concentrated on the work in front of him. She turned back to Mayor Crane. "When can the school be repaired?" "That," he said, leaning forward with renewed energy, "is exactly what I wanted to discuss with you." The man with the leather vest and the freight wagon was named Raymond Easton. Margaret did not learn this until the following morning, when Dorothy Whitfield, who was warm and talkative and seemed to know everything about everyone in Redemption Creek, mentioned him at breakfast while pouring coffee. "That was Raymond Easton you were watching through the window yesterday," Dorothy said without any preamble, setting the coffee pot down and settling into her chair across from Margaret as though they had known each other for years. "Don't blush, honey. It's a small town. Word travels fast. He's a good man. Runs the freighting business with his older brother Cole, though Cole's been in Abilene the past 2 months on account of a contract up there. Margaret had not realized she had been watching anyone in particular. She had simply been looking out the window. I wasn't watching him, she said. Of course not, Dorothy agreed pleasantly and said no more about it. The Whitfield house was comfortable and full of the cheerful noise of Dorothy's 2 children, a boy of 9 named Thomas and a girl of 7 named Alice. Both were bright and clearly restless for school to resume, which gave Margaret a sharp, immediate purpose that she found deeply settling. She spent her first full day in Redemption Creek, walking every inch of the damaged schoolhouse and making notes in a small leather-bound journal she kept in her coat pocket. The building was not beyond saving. That was her first and most important conclusion. The walls were solid adobe brick, and the damage from the fire was concentrated in one corner near what had been the wood stove. Someone had stored green wood too close to it through a cold December night, and the stove had overheated. The fire had consumed the roof and damaged the floor but had not touched the structural walls. She sketched a rough diagram and wrote a list of materials. New roof beams, lumber for the floor, roofing material, nails, a new stove, and new school books. She would need help and she would need money, and from what Mayor Crane had explained, the town's funds were limited. She presented her list to Mayor Crane that afternoon. He studied it with the expression of a man who was simultaneously impressed and overwhelmed. "The lumber and the labor are the hard part," he said. "I can put the word out that we need volunteers for the framing, but the lumber has to be ordered and transported from Careville. That's a freighting job." "Then I need to speak with whoever runs the freighting business," Margaret said. Mayor Crane smiled in a way that suggested he had been expecting this. "Raymond Easton," he said. "His office is on Main Street. You walked past it yesterday." Raymond Easton was 28 years old, and he was sitting at a desk covered in shipping manifests when Margaret walked through the door of Easton Brothers Freighting and Supply that afternoon. He looked up immediately, not with the slow, lazy appraisal she had gotten from the men on the boardwalk, but with the quick, sharp attention of a person whose mind was constantly moving. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who believed in straight lines. And there was a quality to his stillness when he sat back in his chair that reminded Margaret of a man who was very good at waiting. "Miss Turner," he said, and then looked mildly surprised at himself, as though he had not meant to demonstrate that he already knew who she was. "Mr. Easton," she said, because she already knew who he was too, and she saw the corner of his mouth lift almost imperceptibly. She explained what she needed. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he leaned forward and picked up a pencil and pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him and said, "How soon?" "As soon as possible. I have 12 children in this town who should be in school." He made a note. "I can have a wagon to Careville and back inside of 6 days if the weather holds. The lumber and materials you're describing, that's a full load, not a small job. What's the cost?" He named a figure. It was fair, possibly even generous given the distance. She had done enough research in St. Louis to know what freighting rates looked like, and he was not taking advantage of the situation. "I'll need to confirm the town can cover it," she said. "I know Holly's is stretched thin," Raymond said, and there was no judgment in his voice, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement. "If the town can cover the cost of the materials, I'll waive the freighting fee." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged one shoulder, a small, unhurried gesture. "Because those are 12 kids who need a school." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the wind came through the open door and lifted one of the manifests on his desk, and he caught it without looking, pressing it flat with one broad hand. There was something in that small automatic gesture, the ease of it, the competence, that she found unexpectedly disarming. "Thank you," she said. "I'll speak to Mayor Crane today." She turned to leave and then stopped at the door, something occurring to her. "You said if the weather holds. What does the weather look like?" Raymond Easton looked at the square of blue sky visible through his window and then at the dust moving in the street. "Dry," he said. "For now." She nodded and walked out, and she did not let herself look back at him, though she was aware for several steps afterward of the sensation of being watched. Raymond left for Careville 3 days later, early on a Thursday morning before the rest of the town had quite woken up. Margaret knew he was leaving because she was already up, already sitting on the Whitfield front porch with her journal and a cup of coffee she had made herself, going over the list of volunteers who had agreed to help with the schoolhouse framing. She heard the freight wagon before she saw it, the deep rumble of heavy wheels and the steady sound of hooves, and then it came around the curve of the main road and past the end of the street near the Whitfield house, and Raymond Easton was on the driver's bench with his hat pulled low and a canvas coat on against the morning chill. He did not look in her direction. She did not call out. But she watched the wagon until it turned south on the Careville road and was gone, and then she looked back at her list of names and drew a small, deliberate line under the last one. Dorothy Whitfield appeared in the doorway behind her with a second cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who had seen everything and was entertained by most of it. "Early riser," she remarked. "Always have been," Margaret said. Dorothy sat down beside her in the other porch chair and they both looked at the empty road for a moment, and then Dorothy said, comfortably and without malice, "He lost his wife 3 years ago. Influenza. They had only been married a year." Margaret kept her eyes on her journal. "Dorothy, I'm just telling you what everyone knows," Dorothy said serenely. "He's a good man who works hard and never complains and has not looked twice at a woman since Ellen died. Until yesterday. He looked at me because I was a potential client. He looked at you the way a man looks at a woman when he is trying very hard not to look at her in the way that he is looking at her," Dorothy said, and drank her coffee with great satisfaction. Margaret opened her mouth to say something sensible and then closed it again, because she had the uncomfortable feeling that Dorothy Whitfield was not wrong. The 6 days Raymond was gone were full and purposeful. Margaret organized the volunteer work crew, which turned out to be 8 men of varying carpentry ability and boundless willingness, and they began clearing the damaged sections of the schoolhouse and preparing the foundation for the new floor. She worked alongside them, which clearly surprised some of them and earned the respect of others. She was not afraid of hard work. She had grown up watching her father do whatever needed doing with whatever was available, and that had settled into her bones. She taught informal lessons on Dorothy's porch in the afternoons, gathering the children of the town around her with their slates and whatever books she had brought in her trunk, which was 3 readers, 2 arithmetic texts, and a well-worn copy of McGuffey's Eclectic Primer. The children came eagerly, and their eagerness fed something in her that had been quiet and hungry since her father died. This was where she belonged, not the grand schoolhouses of St. Louis, but here, in a place that needed her. On the 6th evening, she was sitting on the porch again after supper, reading by the last of the daylight, when she heard the freight wagon. She heard it before she saw it, and she sat very still for a moment, and then she set her book in her lap and watched the wagon come up the main road, heavy and slow with its load of lumber. Raymond Easton was on the driver's bench, his shoulders carrying the particular set of a man who had been driving for several days straight and was home but not yet willing to show it. He saw her on the porch. She knew he saw her because there was a fractional pause in the steady movement of his gaze across the street, a beat that was too short to be anything conclusive but too long to be nothing at all. He tipped his hat. She raised one hand, a simple acknowledgement. He drove on to the freight yard. She looked back at her book and could not remember for several minutes what she had been reading. The lumber arrived on a Friday, and by Saturday morning half the town seemed to have turned out to help with the schoolhouse. This was the nature of Redemption Creek, Margaret was beginning to understand. It was rough and it was imperfect, and it had its share of hard men and hard circumstances. But when something needed doing for the community showed up. Women brought food and water. Men brought tools. Even the saloon owner, a heavy-set man named Calhoun who wore a brocade vest and smelled of tobacco, came and spent 3 hours nailing down floorboards before declaring that he had done his civic duty and returning to his establishment. Raymond Easton arrived at the schoolhouse at 8 in the morning and worked through the day without stopping, except to eat the lunch that Margaret and Dorothy and several other women had laid out on a pair of sawhorses at midday. He was clearly skilled with his hands, the kind of skilled that came from necessity rather than formal training, and she watched him work from the corner of her eye while pretending to consult her notebook. At one point, he was up on the half-framed roof, moving along a beam with the easy balance of someone comfortable with heights, and he called down to one of the other men about the pitch of the slope, and the other man called something back that made Raymond laugh, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him almost as much as it surprised Margaret, who had been watching him with what she had been telling herself was purely professional interest. She looked away quickly and wrote something entirely unnecessary in her notebook. He came to her at the end of the afternoon, wiping sawdust from his hands with a cloth, and said that they had made good progress and that the roof framing should be finished by the following Saturday if the volunteer crew could hold together. "They will," she said, with more confidence than she strictly had, and he looked at her with that small, almost invisible lift at the corner of his mouth. "You believe that," he said. It was not quite a question. "People generally do what you expect of them," she said. "If you expect the best," he considered this, "that's either very wise or very naive." "I haven't decided which yet," she said honestly, and he looked at her for a moment with something that had shifted slightly from the professional consideration of a man assessing a business contact, and then he put his hat back on and said he would be back next Saturday. He was back the following Tuesday. She was inside the schoolhouse frame, measuring the window openings, when she heard the freight yard doors and looked out through the empty window space and saw him in the yard adjacent, unloading something from a smaller wagon. She finished her measurements and walked out, not because she intended to speak to him, but because her route back to the Whitfield house passed the yard. "I thought you'd be back Saturday," she said. "Realized I had the window frame lumber already in the yard," he said without stopping work. "Seemed foolish to wait." She looked at the lumber he was unstacking. It was good quality, smooth-planed pine. That wasn't in the order. No. Did Mayor Crane authorize additional materials? Raymond set down a long plank and looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. He had a way of doing that, of not quite meeting her eyes until he had something definite to say, and then meeting them fully without evasion. "No, this is from my own stock. Consider it a donation." She felt the impulse to argue, to point out that she had not asked him for donations, that she preferred transactions to be clear and accounted for, that she did not want obligations attached to her work here. But she looked at his face and saw nothing that resembled expectation or calculation. He just looked like a man who had extra lumber and a practical sense of what was needed. "Thank you," she said. "You already said that. I'll say it as many times as it's warranted." Something shifted in his expression, something warm and slightly wary at the same time, like a man who has been standing in the cold for a long time and is not quite sure he trusts the fire. He picked up the plank again and turned back to the wagon. "I'll have these to the schoolhouse by morning." She went back to the Whitfield house and sat at the kitchen table and thought about something Dorothy had said about the way he looked at her, and then she picked up her notebook and made herself think about window dimensions instead. The schoolhouse was finished on the 20th of May, 3 weeks after Margaret had first walked through its burned-out doorway. It had a new roof of sound timber and split shingles, a new floor of smooth pine planks, 4 windows with real glass that Mayor Crane had authorized in a moment of civic pride, a proper iron wood stove installed in the far corner away from any combustible storage, and a new set of shelves along the back wall that Raymond Easton had built himself on a Wednesday afternoon when the volunteer crew had been short on numbers. Margaret stood in the doorway that evening, after everyone else had gone home, and looked at the room she had made out of ash and ambition and the generous labor of a small, imperfect community. The evening light came through the new windows and lay in long golden rectangles across the pine floor, and the room smelled of fresh wood and the faint trace of the whitewash she had applied to the interior walls that afternoon. She heard a step on the threshold behind her. Raymond stood in the doorway, hat in his hand, looking at the room over her shoulder. He had come back for a tool he had left, she supposed, though she did not ask. "It's a good school," he said quietly. "It is," she agreed. They stood side by side in the doorway for a long moment, not touching, not quite looking at each other, and the evening poured itself into the room around them, warm and unhurried. "My wife used to talk about teaching," he said. He said it carefully, the way a person touches something that has been painful to touch, testing whether it still hurts. She never got the chance. Margaret did not fill the silence with something easy. She let it sit the way her father had taught her because some things deserved room to breathe. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. 3 years, he said. "It doesn't go away, but it changes. It's different now." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I wanted you to know that. I'm not sure why." She looked at him then, and he was looking at her, and the light was doing something unfair with the angle of his face, and she felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 3 weeks press itself against the inside of her chest with quiet insistence. "I think I understand why," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and put his hat back on. "School opens Monday." "Monday," she confirmed. "I'll be there," he said. "It's a school, Mr. Easton, not a freight yard." "I know," he said, "but someone should see it on the first day." He paused at the bottom of the step and looked back up at her. "Someone who helped build it." She smiled, and it was a full smile, not the careful professional expression she had been carrying around Redemption Creek for 3 weeks, and she saw him look at it the way a person looks at something that has caught them off guard in the most welcome way possible. He walked away toward the freight yard, and this time she did watch him go. The school opened on a clear Monday morning in late May, and Raymond Easton stood across the street with his hands in his pockets and watched Margaret Turner call 12 children into the new building, with a voice that was clear and warm and carried authority without effort. He watched the last small figure disappear through the door, and then he stood there for another moment looking at the building he had helped raise from a burned-out shell. And something moved in him that he had not felt in a long time, something that was not grief and not loneliness, but something adjacent to hope, which was almost more frightening than either of those other things. He went back to his freight yard and spent the day routing shipments and drafting contracts, and trying not to think too hard about the way Margaret Turner had smiled the previous Friday evening in the schoolhouse doorway. He was unsuccessful on the last point. Cole Easton came back from Abilene on the following Thursday, arriving on the afternoon stage with a sunburned nose and the satisfied expression of a man who had closed a profitable deal. He was 4 years older than Raymond, broader through the shoulders, with the same dark eyes but a louder laugh and a more expansive relationship with conversation. He walked into the freight office and shook his brother's hand, and then looked at the neat state of the desk and the organized filing of the manifests and said, "You've been tidying." "I've been working," Raymond said. "Same thing for you." Cole dropped into the spare chair and stretched his long legs. "What did I miss?" Raymond told him about the school and the lumber contract and the new teacher. He told it efficiently and factually, the way he told everything, but Cole, who had known him for 28 years, listened with an increasingly interested expression. "This teacher," Cole said when Raymond had finished. "What's her name?" "Margaret Turner. And she organized the whole rebuild herself." "Yes. And you donated lumber." "I had stock." "You have stock all the time, and I have never seen you donate any of it," Cole observed. Raymond picked up a manifest and studied it. "We should talk about the Abilene contract." "We'll talk about the Abilene contract," Cole agreed. "But first tell me about Margaret Turner." "There's nothing to tell." Cole looked at his brother with the affectionate skepticism of a man who has watched him avoid things before. "Ray, I've been gone 2 months. I came back to find you've donated materials, worked every Saturday on a volunteer crew, and come home with sawdust in your hair on 3 separate weekdays. None of that is nothing." Raymond set down the manifest. He looked at the window and the street beyond it for a moment. "I don't know what it is yet," he said, and that was the most honest thing he had said about it. Cole nodded, satisfied. "Good. That means you haven't talked yourself out of it." The first time Raymond and Margaret had a conversation that was not about lumber or school supplies or town business was on a Thursday evening in early June, when he happened to come into the general store to pick up an order just as she was finishing her own shopping. They walked out at the same moment, and the evening was warm and there was still an hour of daylight left, and she asked if he knew what kind of tree the large spreading oak was at the eastern edge of town, because she had been wondering since she arrived, and it seemed like something he would know. He did know. It was a Texas live oak, he told her, and they were common in the hill country and did not lose their leaves in winter, which always surprised people who expected a more conventional autumn. He had learned that from a rancher who had lived in the territory for 40 years and seemed to regard every tree as a personal acquaintance. She asked about the rancher, and Raymond told her about old Jacob Marsh, who ran cattle on a piece of land north of town, and who had the remarkable habit of talking to his horses not as animals, but as colleagues whose opinions he genuinely respected. Margaret laughed at this, a real, unguarded laugh, and Raymond looked at her with something openly unguarded in his own expression before he caught himself. They walked past the oak tree and down to the creek that gave the town its name, which was small and brown and persistent, running along the southern edge of town between banks of pale limestone. They stood on the bank and watched the water for a while and talked about things that had nothing to do with business, about the books she had read most recently, and the routes he had traveled for the freighting work, and the question of what a person was supposed to do when a place they had never planned to stay began to feel like home. She had not planned to stay, she told him. It had been a position, a fresh start, a practical solution to practical circumstances. But the children were real, and the need was real, and Redemption Creek was unexpectedly real in a way she had not anticipated. He had not planned to stay either, he said. He had come with Cole 6 years ago to take over a failing freighting operation from a man who wanted to sell and get out, and he had expected to build it up and sell it on. But it had grown, and the people had grown familiar, and then Ellen had come, and there had been a grave to tend, and the leaving had stopped feeling possible. He said this without self-pity as a statement of fact, but she heard the texture of it, the way a person can describe the shape of something without naming its weight. "Are you glad you stayed?" she asked. He looked at the creek for a moment. "I am lately," he said, and then he looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and she felt the warmth of it in her chest like the heat from the schoolhouse stove on a cold morning, sudden and welcome and filling the room. She looked back at the water. "That's a complicated thing to say. I know it." "I'm not sure I'm ready for complicated," she said, honestly, because she had not been ready for anything when she came here. She had been running on necessity and purpose, and she did not know if she had left enough room for something that had no practical dimension at all. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. It was not a pressure or a declaration. It was just a fact offered plainly, the way he offered everything. She nodded. They stood by the creek until the light went gold and then orange, and then the first stars appeared. And then she said she needed to get back for supper, and he said he had the same, and they walked back through town together, not quite touching, and the whole of Redemption Creek seemed to notice and seem quietly pleased. Dorothy Whitfield, who had the uncanny ability to be at a window whenever something interesting was happening in the street, said nothing at supper that evening except to ask whether Margaret had found everything she needed at the general store. "Yes," Margaret said. "Good," Dorothy said, and smiled at her plate. The summer settled into Redemption Creek with the particular intensity of a Texas June, and life found its rhythm. Margaret taught school 5 days a week, and spent her evenings preparing lessons and her weekends walking the hill country around the town, learning its landscape with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She had always believed that understanding the place you lived was a form of respect, and she carried her journal and noted the plants and the formations and the sounds and the way the light changed differently here than it had in Missouri. Raymond began walking with her on Sundays. It started as coincidence, or near enough, when she happened to be heading north on the creek road on a Sunday afternoon, and he was riding back from checking a freight route, and he pulled up his horse and asked where she was going, and she said nowhere in particular, and he tied his horse to a scrub oak and fell into step beside her. After that it became a habit without either of them quite announcing it, the way things can become habits in a small town where the paths are few and the people are paying attention. They talked about everything on those walks, about her childhood in St. Louis and the smell of the schoolroom where her father had taught, and the particular loneliness of being a child who understood things faster than the adults around her would have liked. About his years before Texas, growing up in Virginia, the eldest of 3 children in a family that had lost its money after the war and rebuilt it through stubbornness and work. About Cole and the way brothers move around each other, alternating between contest and cooperation without ever quite resolving which is which. He told her about Ellen once properly, on a Sunday in July when they had climbed a limestone ridge north of town, and were looking out across the pale green and silver of the hill country spreading away from them in every direction. He told her that Ellen had been funny, properly funny in the quick dry way that some people have, and that she had made him laugh more in their year of marriage than he had laughed in the 10 years before it, and that the silence after her death had been the loudest thing he had ever experienced. Margaret listened to all of this without looking away. "I was angry for a long time," he said, "at the illness, at the fact that nothing I could do mattered. I am very accustomed to being able to do something, to fix things. A freight wagon breaks, you fix it. A contract falls through, you find another. There was nothing to fix." "No," she said, "you understand that feeling. I lost both my parents in 2 years," she said. "I understand the part where there is nothing to do and everything needs doing." He looked at her. "Is that why you came here, to have something to do?" She thought about this carefully because she did not want to give him an easy answer. Partly, but also because it was the first thing in a long time that felt like a reason rather than a solution. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. Then he said, "I think you were a reason before you got here. I think this town needed you before it knew it." She looked at his profile against the wide pale sky and felt the warmth again, stronger this time, more certain of itself. She did not deflect it. She let it be there. "Raymond," she said, and he turned at the sound of his name in her voice, at the particular way she said it, and she leaned forward and kissed him briefly and deliberately on the corner of his jaw. He went very still. She sat back and looked at the horizon, and her heart was moving at a pace that she found both alarming and entirely her own business. "That was forward of me," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was not steady. "I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not asking you to." He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and he kissed her properly, with both hands on the sides of her face, with the careful earnestness of a man who understood the value of something and was not going to be careless with it. It was a long kiss and a quiet one, and when it was over they sat for a while with their foreheads almost touching, looking at each other at a distance too small for manners. "I told you I wasn't in a hurry," he said. "You also said you weren't sure what it was," she reminded him. "I'm sure now," he said. Below them, Redemption Creek lay in its valley in the afternoon light, small and imperfect and real, and the school was visible from up here, its new roof gleaming pale in the sun. Cole Easton, when he heard about it, said nothing at all for 10 full seconds and then said, "Good," with the conviction of someone who had been waiting for this outcome since before it was possible. Raymond's courtship of Margaret Turner was conducted with the same quality of focused, unhurried competence that he brought to everything he did, which was to say that it was thoughtful and consistent and entirely genuine. He was not a man who made grand gestures for the sake of theater. He was a man who showed up. He showed up on Tuesday evenings with a lamp, and repaired the sagging step on the Whitfield front porch without being asked, because he had noticed it listing and Dorothy had mentioned her knee. He showed up at the schoolhouse one afternoon with a proper reading stand he had built from good hardwood, because Margaret had been propping her reader against a jar, and he had decided that was not good enough. He showed up on Sundays for their walks without fail, regardless of what the work week had been like, and he was always present in those walks, not distracted, not going through the motions. She noticed all of it. She was a person who paid attention, and she knew the difference between performance and character. There was a difficulty in early August that neither of them had been expecting, and it arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Pratt, who was a land agent from San Antonio and who arrived in Redemption Creek on a Wednesday with papers claiming that the lot on which the schoolhouse sat was his by right of a title dispute that had apparently been simmering unresolved since before the fire. He presented these papers to Mayor Crane with the composed assurance of a man who was confident that documentation would do what he needed it to do, and Mayor Crane, who was not a confrontational man, received them with considerable distress. Margaret heard about this from Dorothy within the hour, as Dorothy heard about most things within the hour, and she went directly to Mayor Crane's office. Gerald Pratt was still there, sitting across the desk from Mayor Crane with the relaxed authority of a man who considered the matter largely settled. He was well dressed in the way of a city businessman, with a good coat and polished boots that had not yet had a chance to meet the dust of the street. He was perhaps 50 years old and had the kind of face that had once been handsome and now looked merely competent. "I'm Margaret Turner," she said from the doorway. "I'm the schoolteacher." "Miss Turner," Pratt said pleasantly, "I believe you've done an admirable job with the school building. I can see you've put considerable work into it." "The town put considerable work into it," she said. "Donated labor and materials and 6 weeks of Saturdays. The building belongs to this community." "The land it sits on," Pratt said, equally pleasantly, "is a matter of documentation." She looked at Mayor Crane. "Has anyone examined the competing claims, formally?" Mayor Crane, looking increasingly like a man who wished he had gone into farming, explained that there was some question about whether the original survey had been properly recorded when the town's founding charter was filed in 1865. "Then the question should be examined," Margaret said, "by someone who understands land title law, not settled by the arrival of papers from a man with an interest in the outcome." Pratt's pleasantness did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened slightly. "Are you suggesting I'm operating outside legal bounds, Miss Turner?" "I'm suggesting that a disputed claim requires a proper process and not a private conversation in a small office," she said. "This is a school. 12 children use it every day. Whatever legal question exists deserves more than a casual resolution." She found Raymond that afternoon in the freight yard and told him what had happened. He listened carefully, and then he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking and not preparing to speak. "Gerald Pratt," he said. "I've heard that name. He's been moving through the hill country for the past year, picking up land on technical title disputes. There was a situation in Comfort last spring. A family lost their home that way. The documentation was legitimate, but the manner of it was not something any decent man would be proud of. Can anything be done?" "Legally, maybe. Cole knows a man in San Antonio, a lawyer who does land title work. If the original charter filing is incomplete, that's a matter that could be contested." He paused. "It will take time and it will cost money the town likely doesn't have." She thought about this. "The children can't lose the school, not after everything." He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant he had already made up his mind about something and was deciding how to say it. "I'll wire Cole tonight, and I'll cover the legal fees if it comes to that." "Raymond." "Margaret," he said, with a quiet finality that was not dismissive but was entirely firm. "This is something I can do. Let me do it." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "All right." It took 3 weeks. Cole's lawyer came from San Antonio and spent 2 days in the county record's office in Careville, and emerged with the information that the original charter had in fact been properly recorded, but the recording had been filed under a slightly different notation, a surveyor's abbreviation rather than the full parcel description, which had caused it to be overlooked by Pratt's own search. The competing claim collapsed under examination. Gerald Pratt left Redemption Creek on a Friday morning, polished boots finally dusty, with the resigned expression of a man who has learned that a small town is not always the easy target it appears to be from a distance. Margaret found Raymond in the freight yard when she heard, and she walked in and said simply, "The school is safe." He turned from what he had been doing, and his face opened in a way she had seen it do only rarely, a full, uncomplicated relief. "Good," he said. "That's good." She crossed the yard and took his hand without planning to, and he held it without hesitation, and they stood in the yard in the August heat with the smell of hay and dust around them, and the sound of the town carrying on its ordinary life, and she thought that this was what it looked like, the thing she had not been sure she had room for. It looked like standing in a freight yard holding a man's hand and feeling, for the first time in several years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Cole Easton came back from returning the lawyer to the stage that afternoon and found them sitting on the bench outside the freight office with 2 cups of coffee, talking in the easy, unhurried way that people talk when they have run out of reasons to be careful around each other. He looked at his brother and at Margaret and at their 2 cups of coffee and said, with great satisfaction, "I'm going to need a bigger office." Raymond looked at him blankly and then realized he was implying something about the future of the current living arrangements, and Margaret laughed and Cole laughed, and even Raymond smiled, which was rarer and therefore more valuable than the laughter of other men. September brought the first real cool of the year, and with it a change in the quality of everything, the light going from sharp and white to something gentler and more golden, the evenings shortening, the hill country turning amber and russet in the late afternoons. The school was full, and Margaret had added 3 more children to her roll as 2 families moved into Redemption Creek from ranches further out that could not manage winter schooling. She was not a large person, but she seemed to expand to fill whatever space the work required of her, and Raymond watched this with an admiration that he found increasingly difficult to contain. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in late September, on the limestone ridge north of town where he had kissed her for the first time, because it seemed right to go back to where things had begun. He had Cole's grandmother's ring, which Cole had pressed into his hand the previous evening with the quiet, understanding manner of a man who has been watching his brother come back to life and wants to do something to help it along. He did not make a speech. He said, "I know I come with complications. I know what I've been through and what I bring with me. I am not a simple man or a simple situation. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of you, and I would like to spend whatever time I have left on this earth doing right by you, if you'll have me." Margaret looked at him in the golden September afternoon, and she thought about all the roads that had led here, the loss and the work and the small, uncertain steps towards something she had not dared to name for months. She thought about her father and her mother and the house in St. Louis and the stagecoach and the burned-out schoolhouse and 12 children with their slates on a porch. She thought about a man in a leather vest catching a paper in the wind without looking. "Yes," she said, with considerable pleasure. He put the ring on her finger and it fit as though it had been waiting, and he kissed her in the September light, and she held his face in her hands the way he had held hers the first time, and the hill country spread away from them in every direction, enormous and beautiful and entirely indifferent to small human moments, except that it contained them and always would. They married in November, on a clear cold day that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. The ceremony was simple, performed by the circuit preacher who came through Redemption Creek every 6 weeks, and held in the new schoolhouse because it was the largest public building in town, and because it seemed right to Margaret that the building she had helped raise should be the place where this beginning was made. Dorothy Whitfield cried with undisguised happiness, and Cole Easton stood beside his brother and was, for perhaps the first time in his expansive life, entirely speechless. The whole town came, which was the custom and the nature of Redemption Creek, and Calhoun brought bottles of something celebratory from the saloon, and old Jacob Marsh came in from his ranch and shook Raymond's hand and told Margaret that she was the best thing to walk into this town since running water, which everyone agreed was the highest compliment in his considerable vocabulary. The first winter of their marriage was cold and close, and everything that the previous months had been building toward. They lived in the house Raymond had built 2 years after his arrival, which was solid and well-made, and had a covered porch facing south that caught the afternoon sun. And Margaret brought her leather trunk and her books and her journal and her particular quality of organized, energetic intelligence. And the house, which had been functional and a little bare, became inhabited in the fullest sense of the word. They learned each other in the daily way that married people do, the negotiations of small habits, and the discoveries of preferences, and the particular comfort of having someone who knows where you are when you come home. He woke early and she stayed up late, so they had mornings where the coffee was already made when she stumbled to the kitchen, and evenings where the lamp was still burning when he came back from the freight yard. He was quiet and she was not, or more precisely, she was quiet about herself and vocal about everything else, and he learned to tell the difference between the silence that meant she was content and the silence that meant something was wrong. She learned that he processed things slowly and completely, that he did not give opinions easily but that when he gave them they were real, and that his version of affection was action rather than speech, though when he did speak it was always worth hearing. They were happy. It was not the dramatic happiness of songs and poems, not the spectacular kind that requires an audience. It was the kind that builds itself out of ordinary days and holds its shape because it has been built honestly, and it was more than either of them had expected to find when they were not looking for it. In the spring of 1875, a few months after the wedding, Raymond's brother Cole met a woman named Helen Marsh, old Jacob Marsh's niece, who had come from Arkansas to help her uncle through an illness, and then stayed because Redemption Creek suited her, and Cole Easton had somehow become part of Redemption Creek in a way she found relevant to her future. Cole, who had been comfortable being loud and charming and entirely unburdened by romantic complication, fell for Helen Marsh with the totality and bewilderment of a man who has been struck by lightning in broad daylight. And Raymond found this deeply gratifying in a way he did not say out loud, but which showed in the quality of his patience, when Cole showed up at the freight office in a state of distracted preoccupation for the 3rd morning in a row. "I believe," Raymond told his brother one morning, leaning back in his chair with the dignity of a man dispensing wisdom earned through personal experience, "that you are done for." Cole stared at the wall. "I think I am," he said, with the wondering tone of a man receiving a diagnosis he had not sought but could not argue with. Helen Marsh was a quiet woman with strong opinions and good humor, and she and Margaret became friends almost immediately, which Raymond and Cole agreed was either a remarkable coincidence or a natural law of some kind. The spring of 1875 was also the spring that Margaret realized, with a combination of joy and terror, that she kept to herself for several days before telling anyone, that she was expecting a child. She told Raymond on a Tuesday evening after supper, not with a speech or an elaborate setting, but simply by sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and saying, in the same clear voice she used for everything, "I believe we are going to have a child." The expression that crossed Raymond Easton's face in that moment was something Margaret would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not simply happiness, though it was happiness, but it was also something tender and frightened and fiercely alive, the face of a man confronting something too large and too important for his usual composure, and she saw in it everything he felt and everything he had lost and everything this meant to him, and she reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. "We're going to be all right," she said. "All of us." He held her hands very tightly and did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "I know that. I know it is." Dorothy Whitfield, upon hearing the news, said that she had known before either of them, which was probably true, and began immediately and without invitation to plan a proper quilt, which was her response to all major life events, and which, Margaret had come to understand, was a form of love. Cole received the news with loud joy and immediately began an extended monologue about names, none of which were acceptable, which Raymond and Margaret agreed on with rare unanimity. The summer was warm and long, and Margaret taught school until the 1st of August, and then conceded to the practical necessities of the situation, leaving the school in the capable temporary hands of a young woman from town, named Clara Fenn, who had been helping Margaret with the younger students, and who turned out to be gifted and enthusiastic in ways that Margaret was gratified to have discovered. Raymond was attentive through the summer with the same quality he brought to everything, practical and steady, and never making her feel fragile, which was exactly what she needed because she did not feel fragile. She felt enormous and impatient and full of a brightness that had no outlet. Their son was born on a September morning in 1875, in the bedroom of the house on the south-facing porch, with Dorothy in attendance and the doctor from Careville present, and Cole pacing the freight yard next door with the nervous energy of a man, in a proximity to significant events, who has no role to play in them. Raymond was in the room because he had asked to be, and because Margaret had told him he was staying, and that was the end of it, and he held her hand through the whole of it with the same quality of unshakable presence that he had brought to everything since she had known him. The baby was a boy, healthy and indignant, with dark hair that lay flat and damp against a face that was red and furious and entirely extraordinary. Raymond held him with his arms locked in a frame of complete, concentrated care, and the expression on his face was something Margaret had no word for and did not need one. They named him William, after her father. Cole Easton, when he was allowed in, looked at William for a long moment and then at his brother and said nothing at all, which for Cole was the loudest possible response. Old Jacob Marsh sent a gift from the ranch, a small leather hat, already worked soft, with a note in cramped handwriting that said only, "For the next generation of Redemption Creek." Dorothy Whitfield arrived with the quilt, which was magnificent, in deep blues and golds and cream, and presented it with the satisfied expression of a woman who had known it was going to be needed long before it was needed. William was 2 months old when Cole married Helen Marsh in the same schoolhouse where Raymond and Margaret had married, and William attended the wedding in Margaret's arms and slept through the entire ceremony with the profound disinterest of someone who has more important things to do, and everyone who held him declared him the most sensible person in attendance. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was a hard one, cold and dry, and the hill country pulled in on itself the way it did when the weather was demanding, but Redemption Creek was a town that knew how to hold itself together. The school stayed warm with the iron stove and the split wood that Raymond and several other men had cut and stacked in October, and Margaret returned to teaching in January, bringing William with her on the days Dorothy was not available, which the children found spectacular. William, who was developing the sociable and loud tendencies that suggested he had received equal parts of both his parents, appeared to find 12 children focusing their attention on him entirely acceptable. Raymond's business grew through 1876, the centennial year, when the country was loud with its own celebration, and the Texas Hill Country was filling with new settlers and new commerce, and the freighting routes were busier than they had ever been. He and Cole expanded the operation, adding 2 more wagons and hiring 3 drivers, and Raymond was sometimes gone for 3 or 4 days at a time on longer routes, which Margaret managed with the efficient practicality she brought to everything, and which she would not have admitted bothered her except in the late evenings when the house was quiet and William was sleeping, and the south porch was dark, and the stars over the hill country were very many and very far away. But he always came back. He came back and walked through the door, and she heard his step on the porch, and William, who was crawling by now and had opinions about everything, would look toward the door with an expression of concentrated interest, and Raymond would come in and pick up his son and look at his wife, and the house would fill up with itself again, with the weight of his presence and the sound of his voice and the particular quality of complete that she had never expected to feel and did not take for granted. In the spring of 1877, Redemption Creek got a newspaper. It was a small operation, one press, one editor, a man named Amos Birch who had come from Austin with ink-stained hands and a passionate belief in the importance of local journalism. He came to Margaret immediately and asked if she would contribute a column, and she said yes on the spot, because she had opinions about education and civic life, and she had been keeping them in her journal for lack of a better place to put them. The column ran for the next 2 years and caused several heated conversations in Calhoun's saloon and led directly to the town council allocating more funds for the school, which was the practical point of it all and the reason she had written it. Raymond read every column without comment for the first 3, and then after the 4th one, which addressed the question of whether the town had done enough for the families of the 3 Apache workers who had been employed by the railroad survey team and then left without wages when the survey was canceled, he said, "That's going to make some people uncomfortable." "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I agree with every word of it," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm aware it's not nothing." "I know you know," she said. "That's why I married you." He did not answer that in words, but the expression on his face was sufficient. The summer of 1877 was the summer that William took his first steps and said his first word, which was not mama or papa, but rather out, delivered with commanding clarity in the direction of the front door, which Raymond found so funny that he had to sit down, and which Margaret received with the philosophical acceptance of a woman who had known from the first days of her son's life that he was going to be a person who knew what he wanted. It was also the summer that Helen and Cole announced they were expecting, which news Cole delivered to Raymond in the freight office with the same wondering, slightly stunned expression Raymond had worn 2 years earlier, and Raymond received it with a smile that held everything it should have held and said, quietly, "You're going to be all right, all of you." Cole looked at him. "That's what Margaret said to you, isn't it?" "Word for word," Raymond said. The years moved through Redemption Creek the way years move in a place where people are putting down roots, not quickly and not slowly, but with a kind of accumulating weight that is itself a form of evidence that something has been built and is continuing to be built. Margaret taught school. Raymond ran the freight business. Cole and Raymond expanded further still, and Cole and Helen had a son, James, born in early 1878, followed by a daughter 2 years later. The school grew, and Margaret trained Clara Finn fully and brought her on permanently, and together they managed a school that was, by 1879, one of the better-regarded institutions in the hill country, visited twice by a county education supervisor who left each time with the expression of a man who had expected less and found more. William grew into a boy who combined his father's focused competence with his mother's intellectual curiosity and his father's quiet humor, which was a combination that made him simultaneously excellent company and a person who could be infuriatingly right about things. Raymond watched his son with the particular pride of a man who sees in a child not a reflection of himself, but something entirely new and better. There were ordinary difficulties. A dry summer in 1879 that stressed the ranchers and reduced commerce, and meant the freight business had lean months that required careful management. A dispute with a competing freighting operation out of Careville that Cole handled with more force than Raymond would have chosen, but that resolved itself adequately. A winter illness that went through the town in 1878 and took 2 children, which lay on Margaret's heart with a weight she did not fully speak of, but which Raymond felt in the way she held William those weeks, a little tighter than usual, a little longer. She told him about it one night, sitting on the south porch in the spring of 1879, the hill country dark and warm around them and William asleep inside, and the sound of the creek just audible in the quiet. "I am afraid sometimes," she said, "of the things I can't control, the illness, the weather, the title disputes, and all the ways that things can go wrong in a place like this." "I know," he said. "I wasn't afraid before," she said. "Not like this. I had nothing to lose." He took her hand. "That's not a bad kind of fear," he said. "It means something." She leaned against his shoulder and looked at the dark shape of the hill country against the stars. "You're very wise for a freight man," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. She laughed against his shoulder and he held her, and the night was quiet and warm, and the stars were the same stars that had been over the hill country for 10,000 years and would be there long after all of them, and that was all right. It was more than all right. It was the whole thing. In the early spring of 1880, Margaret realized she was expecting again. This time she told Raymond immediately, sitting on the porch in the morning light over their first coffee, and his face this time was different, the same love and joy but without the shadow of the first time, without the fear, settled and sure. "A brother for William," he suggested. "Or a sister," she said. "Either," he said. "Both eventually." She looked at him. "How many children are you planning to have?" "As many as you'll agree to," he said, with the straightforwardness that was the thing about him she had loved from almost the beginning. She looked at her coffee and at the hill country, and at the husband she had found by accident and kept on purpose. "We'll see," she said, which was not a no, and both of them knew it. Their second child was a girl, born in October of 1880, with her mother's dark hair and her father's dark eyes, and a disposition that made itself known from the first hours as one that combined both her parents' qualities of paying close attention before acting, which Dorothy Whitfield said was the most promising thing she had ever heard of in a newborn. They named her Ellen. Raymond held his daughter for the first time with his face turned slightly away from everyone in the room for a moment, and Margaret, who knew him completely by now, said nothing and simply waited. And when he turned back his eyes were bright, and his voice when he spoke to his daughter was steady and full of everything a name carries, and everything a life builds forward from. The town of Redemption Creek, by 1881, was not quite the raw settlement Margaret had stepped off the stagecoach into 7 years earlier. It had a proper hotel now, and a second general store, and the newspaper, and a doctor who had settled permanently rather than passing through, and a telegraph office that had arrived in 1879, and which had transformed the commerce of the area in ways both Raymond and Cole had adapted to with the practical shrewdness that had built the business to what it was. The schoolhouse had been expanded twice, and Clara Fenn was a full partner in the teaching enterprise, managing the younger grades while Margaret took the older students, and they had between them 43 children enrolled, which was a number that still astonished Margaret when she added it up. She was 31 years old in 1881, and she had been in Redemption Creek for 7 years, and it was as much hers as anything had ever been hers, more so because she had chosen it and built it and been built by it in return. Raymond was 35, and the freight business was the largest operation of its kind in the hill country, and he was thinking about the next expansion, a possible rail connection to Careville, and what that might mean for routes and contracts, and he talked about it in the evenings with the focused energy of a man whose ambitions were practical and clearly defined, which Margaret found endlessly interesting because the ambitions were always about the work and never about the accumulation, about what could be done and not what could be owned. Cole and Helen had 3 children now, and the two families were so intertwined in the life of the town that people had mostly stopped distinguishing between Easton households when it came to civic matters, just assumed that anything involving one was likely to involve the other. Old Jacob Marsh died in the spring of 1881 at an age he estimated at somewhere north of 75, and left his land to Helen and Cole, and the loss of him was felt in the town the way the loss of the oldest trees is felt, not catastrophic but a change in the shape of the sky. At his burial, several men told stories about him and his habit of talking to his horses as colleagues, and Margaret wrote about him in her newspaper column with the care and honesty she brought to everything she wrote. And Raymond read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when he finished he set it down and said, he would have been very pleased. William started working Saturday mornings at the freight yard in the summer of 1881, at the age of almost 6, which was mostly a matter of handing his father tools and observing operations with the concentrated attention of someone gathering data, but which Raymond treated as genuine employment with genuine dignity, and which William took with complete seriousness. He was a boy who already understood the weight of things and did not treat important matters lightly, and he moved through the freight yard with a caution and precision that made the drivers look at each other and smile, not unkindly. Ellen, 1 year old in the autumn of 1881, was already a person of very clear opinions, mostly expressed through the direction of her attention and the quality of her silences, which Dorothy Whitfield said was exactly her mother at 1 year old, and which Margaret received as the highest possible compliment. There was a morning in December of 1881 that Margaret would remember for a long time, for no reason that was dramatic or significant in any external sense. It was a cold morning, clear and still, with frost on the porch railing and the smell of the cedar coming down from the hills, and she came out early with her coffee, and William came out behind her still half asleep with his hair standing up, and wrapped himself against her side with the unself-conscious trust of a child who has always been safe. And Raymond came out last, carrying Ellen, who was awake and solemn, and looking at the frost with the concentration of a scientist observing a new phenomenon. They stood on the south porch of the house on the edge of Redemption Creek, Texas, in December of 1881, the 4 of them, and the hill country lay out before them in the cold morning light, enormous and beautiful and enduring. Margaret thought about the stagecoach, about the burned-out school, about a man in a leather vest catching a paper in the wind, about limestone ridges and creek banks and the smell of new wood and the weight of a hand in hers. Raymond was looking at the hills, and she watched his profile against the pale morning sky and felt the thing in her chest that had never gone away, that had only grown more certain of itself over 7 years, the thing she had not had room for until she did, the thing that looked in the end like this. He turned and found her watching him and did not look away. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She looked at him, and at the boy against her side, and at the small, serious girl in his arms looking at the frost, and at the town where she had built something real and lasting and entirely her own. "That we're exactly where we're supposed to be," she said. He reached out and took her hand, standing side by side in the cold morning, and Redemption Creek lay below them in the winter light, and the school was there, and the freight yard, and the houses of all the people who had become her people, and the hill country went on in every direction as far as she could see, vast and permanent and full of the kinds of roads that lead, if you are honest about where you want to go, to somewhere worth arriving. The frost on the porch railing caught the first light of the rising sun and held it a moment, bright and cold and temporary and beautiful, and then the sun rose fully and the day came on, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the way all the best days do. William said, as he sometimes did in the early mornings when the world was new and open, "Tell me something, Papa." Raymond looked at his son for a moment, and then at his daughter and then at his wife. He said simply and entirely, "Everything is good," and it was. It was the kind of good that builds itself out of loss and work and honesty, and the willingness to be changed by the right person at the right time, the kind that doesn't announce itself in declarations, but shows up in the daily weight of 2 people choosing each other in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of a life. In a small town carved out of the Texas hill country, by people who were too stubborn or too brave or too full of something they could not name to go anywhere else. Margaret Turner had come to Redemption Creek with a letter of confirmation in her pocket and nothing else secured. She had stayed because 12 children needed a school, and because the land had a quality of reality she had been hungry for, and because a man in a freight yard had caught a paper in the wind without looking, and somehow that had been the first line of a story that was nowhere near finished. Raymond Easton had stayed because there was a grave to tend and work to do, and a town that needed him even when he had stopped needing it back. And then he had met a woman who walked into a burned-out schoolhouse and saw a school, who looked at a damaged thing and saw what it could be, and who had the particular, rare quality of making him feel that the things he could do were exactly enough. They had William, who would grow up in the freight yard and the schoolhouse and on the limestone ridges above town, carrying both his parents in his bones. They had Ellen, who would grow up with her mother's attention and her father's stillness and her own particular brand of quiet, devastating intelligence. They had Cole and Helen next door and Dorothy Whitfield down the road and Clara Fenn, who kept the school growing, and Amos Birch at the newspaper, who put their stories in print, and the wide, enduring hill country all around them, full of cedar and limestone and live oaks that did not lose their leaves in winter. It was not a perfect place. Redemption Creek in 1880, one was still imperfect in all the ways a small Texas town was imperfect, with its injustices and its inequalities and its habit of looking away from what was uncomfortable. Margaret's column in the newspaper continued to say things that needed to be said, and Raymond continued to back her in the saying of them, quietly and consistently, in the way he backed everything he believed in. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it held them as they held it, and the mornings kept coming, cold and clear and full of frost on the railing, and the children kept growing, and the freight wagons kept moving on the Careville Road, and the school kept filling with the children of people who had chosen this place out of all the places they could have gone, and Margaret Turner Easton stood on her south-facing porch in the December of her 31st year and understood, with the completeness that only comes from having found the thing you were not sure you were looking for, that she was home, that she had always been, in some direction she could not have named from St. Louis, on her way to this exact porch, this exact morning, this exact man, this exact life. The sun rose fully over the hill country, and the frost melted from the railing, and the town of Redemption Creek woke and set itself to the ordinary business of living. And in the freight yard, Raymond Easton kissed his wife at the gate before the day began, and she kissed him back. And William walked in through the gate with the settled dignity of a boy who belongs exactly where he is, and Ellen reached from her father's arms toward her mother. And the December light was clean and cold, and the cedar smell came down from the hills, and everything was, in all the ways that mattered and continued to matter long after the frost had gone, good.